Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time, not to a grand ball or a heroic battlefield, but to a much grimmer reality. Imagine, for a moment, the cramped, bustling streets of a 19th century city. The air is thick with the smell of coal smoke, horse manure, and humanity. You're walking among throngs of people, your breath misting in the cool, damp air. You might feel a slight chill, a tickle in your throat, and you brush it off as nothing. But what if that seemingly innocuous cough was the first whisper of a terrifying, often fatal secret tonight? We're peeling back the layers of polite society to reveal the truly disturbing reality of tuberculosis, or consumption as they called it. In the 1800s, it was an invisible predator lurking in every shadow, claiming lives with ruthless efficiency. And frankly, you probably wouldn't have survived it. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Let me know where you're listening from, and what time it is for you. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You live in a world where an unseen enemy, silent and relentless, stalks every family, every neighborhood. This enemy isn't an invading army or a wild beast, it's a microscopic bacterium. Mycobacterium tuberculosis. But in the 19th century, no one knew that. They just saw the devastating effects. The slow, wasting decline, the coughs that rattled chests and splattered blood. You call it consumption, a fitting name, for it seemed to consume its victims from the inside out. In the bustling metropolises, where industrialization had herded millions into cramped, unsanitary tenements, the disease found its perfect breeding ground: the air, heavy with the stench of poverty and neglect, carried the invisible killer from one person to the next, a deadly dance of breath and droplet. Imagine your grandmother, a stoic woman with eyes that have seen too much. She starts with a persistent cough, just a little hack at first, dismissed as a winter chill. Then it deepens, becomes more frequent, a wet, ragged sound that vibrates through the thin walls of your home. You watch as her cheeks, once rosy, begin to hollow. Her eyes sink, and a persistent fever keeps her confined to bed. Her nights are punctuated by fits of coughing, and sometimes, in the dim light of the oil lamp, you catch a glimpse of blood on her handkerchief. This isn't just a story. This is the reality for countless families. The disease wasn't just a medical condition, it was a social fabric terror, a destroyer of futures. You hear hushed whispers in the marketplace, tales of families wiped out, one by one. The tailor down the street, his wife, and then their youngest child, all gone within a year. Their beds still warm from their last breath. It's an unspoken dread that hangs in the air, heavier than the fog that often settles over the city. You try to avoid those who cough, instinctively pulling your shawl tighter, averting your gaze, even though you know, deep down, that the enemy is invisible. You walk through crowded streets, past bustling factories belching smoke, and through narrow alleyways where sunlight rarely reaches. Every breath you take, every hand you shake, feels like a gamble. The sheer scale of the epidemic is almost unfathomable from our modern perspective. In cities like London, Paris, and New York, tuberculosis was responsible for 1 in 4 deaths. Think about that for a moment if you gathered 4 people from any walk of life. Statistically, one of them was destined to die from consumption. It didn't discriminate by age, although the young and the elderly were particularly vulnerable and didn't care about your wealth, though poverty certainly accelerated its progress. It was a democratic killer, touching everyone's lives in some way, either directly or through the suffering of a loved one. The chilling statistics are merely numbers, but behind each number lies a shattered life, a grieving family, and a future unfulfilled. you notice how the disease subtly shapes the very rhythm of life. Funerals are frequent, almost commonplace. Black armbands are a regular sight on the sleeves of passersby. The very language used to describe people changes. With terms like delicate constitution or frail carrying a loaded. Unspoken meaning. Young women, particularly, were often seen as susceptible. Their delicacy, a perceived sign of vulnerability to the disease. You might even hear macabre jokes. Dark humor born of desperation. About how certain types of beauty were consumptive beauty, a pale. Ethereal look that, in reality, was a harbinger of doom. One common historical fact often overlooked is the sheer omnipresence of the disease in everyday life. It wasn't just in hospitals or specialized institutions. It was in your homes, in your workplaces. In the very air you breathed, people continued to work, often until they were too weak to stand. Children played in the streets, unknowingly sharing germs. The idea of airborne transmission, of microscopic particles floating in the air, was still a scientific frontier. Instead, people clung to outdated theories, believing the disease was caused by bad air, or miasma, or even an imbalance of the humors. You might try to air out your rooms, burning strong-smelling herbs, hoping to ward off the invisible pestilence, but to little avail. A lesser-known detail about this period is the phenomenon of consumption parties, or TB dances. It sounds morbid, doesn't it? But imagine a desperate attempt to grasp at life, to celebrate while you still could. These gatherings were sometimes held for individuals in the advanced stages of the disease. A last hurrah, a final chance to socialize before the inevitable. You might attend one of these. Watching a loved one, their eyes unnaturally bright with fever, dancing weakly, a bittersweet smile on their lips. The air would be thick with anticipation and sorrow, a desperate attempt to find joy in the face of absolute despair. It's a chilling reminder of how intimately people lived with the specter of death. Historians still debate whether the romanticization of consumption, leading to the consumptive chic aesthetic, genuinely increased the disease's prevalence by encouraging less cautious behavior, or if it was simply a coping mechanism, a way to find beauty in an otherwise hideous reality. Did the pale skin, the flushed cheeks, the glittering eyes, which were all symptoms of the disease, become desirable traits, leading young women to even try to achieve such an appearance? Perhaps by staying indoors or wearing restrictive clothing that further weakened their lungs. Or was it simply that people, surrounded by death, sought to find some aesthetic meaning, some tragic beauty, in the suffering that was so pervasive? You see portraits of the era, and sometimes you can almost pick out the telltale signs, the hollowed cheeks, the slightly vacant stare, the subtle pallor that hints at the insidious illness. The reality was far from romantic. The cough would worsen, the fever would spike, and the weight loss would become drastic. You'd see the ribs protruding, the skin stretched taut over bones, and the once vibrant eyes would dim. The night sweats would leave victims drenched, their bedding soaked through, adding another layer of discomfort to their suffering. It wasn't a quick, merciful death. It was a slow, agonizing decline, often lasting months, even years. And during that time, the sick individual would unwittingly become a source of infection for those around them. Continuing the cycle of disease, the home became a crucible of fear and contagion, where family members lived under the constant threat of succumbing to the same fate as their loved ones. You might find yourself dreading the sound of a cough, knowing what it could portend. This invisible enemy, while devastating, also inadvertently laid the groundwork for future medical advancements and public health reforms. The sheer scale of the problem forced doctors and scientists to look beyond outdated theories, to meticulously observe, to document, and to search for answers. You might not realize it now, but the constant presence of consumption spurred early forms of medical research and public awareness campaigns. however rudimentary. The despair it caused was a powerful motivator, pushing humanity towards a deeper understanding of disease and the critical importance of sanitation and healthy living. But that was still a long way off. For now, you are simply navigating a world where the air itself seems to harbor a silent, deadly secret. You're living in an era where the enemy is everywhere, yet utterly invisible. And the medical understanding of the day is, to put it mildly, rudimentary. When that telltale cough begins, or when the fever takes hold, you turn to the wisdom of the time, a collection of remedies ranging from the quaintly ineffective to the downright bizarre. Forget about antibiotics or x-rays, those are centuries away. Instead, your best hope, or perhaps your most desperate gamble, lies in concoctions and treatments rooted in ancient beliefs and sheer superstition. Imagine your neighbor, old Mrs. Henderson, a woman known for her herbal remedies and her unwavering belief in the power of a good poultice. When her youngest son, Thomas, starts to waste away, she doesn't think of bacteria. She thinks of imbalances, of humors, of a body out of sync. You might see her brewing noxious-smelling teas from foxglove and hellebore, or applying a thick paste of ground-up snails to Thomas's chest, believing its slimy coolness will draw out the heat of the fever. The air in their small cottage is perpetually thick with the scent of various pungent herbs, a testament to her tireless, yet ultimately futile, efforts, one of the most common and deeply ingrained. Beliefs was the idea of miasma. You see, people believed that diseases, including consumption, were caused by bad air, foul smells emanating from decaying organic matter, stagnant water, or overcrowded slums. So, your immediate reaction when someone falls ill might be to open every window, even in the bitterest winter, hoping to air out the sickness. You might light aromatic candles or burn strong-smelling resins, thinking that a pleasant odor could somehow repel the invisible illness. This is why you often see depictions of 19th century sick rooms with windows flung wide open. A practice that, while perhaps offering some ventilation, did little to combat airborne bacteria. Then there were the more inventive cures. You hear whispers of people trying animal magnetism, where a practitioner would wave magnets over the patient's body, claiming to rebalance their vital energies. Perhaps you even know someone who tried phrenology, believing that bumps on the skull could reveal predispositions to illness. And thus, guide treatment. The sheer desperation fuels these practices, when death is so common, when conventional medicine offers so little. People are willing to try almost anything. It's a testament to human hope, even when that hope is misplaced. One particularly grim remedy involved drinking the blood of various animals, particularly those believed to be strong or pure, like a freshly slaughtered bull or even a lamb. The logic, twisted as it was, stemmed from the idea that consuming the vitality of a healthy creature could somehow restore your own. You might hear hushed accounts of people in the countryside seeking out such gruesome treatments, their faces pale with illness, their eyes desperate. It's a stark reminder of the lengths to which people would go, driven by fear and a lack of scientific understanding. And let's not forget the quack cures that proliferated. Advertised in newspapers and sold by traveling charlatans, you'd see advertisements promising miraculous elixirs, guaranteed to cure consumption, often containing a potent mix of alcohol, opium, and various inert substances. These patent medicines were a booming industry, preying on the vulnerable and the desperate. You might even purchase one yourself, reading the grand claims on the bottle, feeling a flicker of hope as you swallowed the bitter liquid, only to be met with disappointment and perhaps a deeper decline. The sheer number of these products on the market, all promising the moon and delivering nothing, speaks volumes about the lack of effective treatments available to you. The medical establishment, while well-intentioned, often contributed to the confusion. Doctors, lacking germ theory, relied on outdated practices like bleeding and purging, believing that removing bad blood or inducing vomiting and diarrhea could cleanse the body of disease. You might find yourself being bled by a barber surgeon, the crimson liquid flowing into a bowl as you grow weaker, not stronger. The instruments are rudimentary. Hygiene is often an afterthought, and the concept of sterilization is still decades away. It's a terrifying thought. The very people trying to help you might, unknowingly, be making you worse, or at least contributing to your decline. A common historical understanding is that people died from consumption because there were no drugs. This is true, but what is often overlooked is the sheer variety of desperate, often harmful, cures people subjected themselves to. It wasn't just a lack of effective treatment. It was an abundance of ineffective or detrimental ones. Think of the psychological toll this must have taken constantly trying new remedies, spending precious savings, enduring painful procedures, only to watch yourself or your loved ones fade away. A more obscure detail is the belief in royal touch. For centuries, some believed that a monarch possessed the divine power to heal diseases, particularly scrofula, a form of tuberculosis that affected the lymph nodes, while largely fading by the 19th century. Echoes of such beliefs persisted. You might hear older folk talk of how, in times past, the king's touch could have cured what ailed you, a melancholic longing for a simpler, if equally unscientific, solution. It highlights the deep-seated human need for a definitive cure, even if that cure defied all logic. Historians still debate whether the pervasive use of opium in many patent medicines, ostensibly to soothe coughs and induce sleep, inadvertently masked the progression of consumption, delaying diagnosis and potentially worsening outcomes. Did the temporary relief from symptoms lull people into a false sense of security, preventing them from seeking more rigorous, if still ineffective, care? Or was it a merciful palliative, offering a brief respite from the agonizing symptoms? A small kindness in a world devoid of true medical solutions. You can imagine the dilemma: do you endure the pain and relentless coughing, or do you seek temporary solace in a drug that might be delaying the inevitable, or even hastening it? The prevailing medical philosophy often focused on rest and fresh air, which, while not a cure, at least wasn't actively harmful. You might be advised to move to the countryside, to a sanatorium if you could afford it, or simply to spend your days resting in a well-ventilated room. This was perhaps the closest to a beneficial recommendation, though without understanding the bacterial cause, it was more of a shot in the dark than a targeted treatment. You see those desperate families, pooling their meager resources, trying to send a sick loved one to a higher, drier climate, clinging to the hope that a change of air might bring about a miracle. The sheer effort, the financial strain, all for a hope that was usually dashed. Even basic hygiene was often misunderstood. The idea of washing hands before surgery, of sterilizing instruments, was a revolutionary concept still in its infancy. Doctors, proud of their work, might move from one patient to another, inadvertently carrying the disease on their hands or instruments. You'd see medical professionals, their sleeves stained, their hands unwashed. A chilling thought given what we now know about germ transmission. The very tools meant to heal could, and often did, spread the disease further. It's a truly disturbing reality to contemplate. Knowing that the very people sworn to heal were operating in a world utterly blind to the true nature of contagion, the remedies were as diverse as they were ineffective. A testament to humanity's desperate struggle against an invisible foe. From folk remedies passed down through generations to elaborate, pseudo-scientific machines, people explored every avenue, every possibility, hoping for a miracle that would not arrive for many more decades. You live with this constant uncertainty, this gnawing fear, always wondering if the next cough, the next fever, will be the beginning of your own slow decline. And what bizarre, desperate remedy you might be forced to try. You're navigating a society where a devastating illness not only stalks every family, but paradoxically, also shapes the very fabric of art, fashion, and social perception. This is the 19th century, and tuberculosis, or consumption, has cultivated a peculiar, almost disturbing, aesthetic. It's an era where the symptoms of a fatal disease become, in a strange twist of fate, almost desirable. Imagine walking through a bustling salon. You see young women, their skin porcelain pale, their cheeks delicately flushed, their eyes unnaturally bright. This isn't a sign of robust health, it's the insidious mark of consumption. Yet, this fragile, ethereal appearance is lauded as beautiful. Poets pen verses about the angelic pallor of the consumptive. Artists capture their delicate features on canvas, and novelists weave tales of doomed lovers fading beautifully away. You might even find yourself, subconsciously, admiring this look, even as a shiver of dread runs down your spine. Knowing its true meaning, this wasn't merely an unfortunate coincidence, it was a bizarre cultural phenomenon. The disease, with its slow, wasting progression, often led to a loss of body fat, making the eyes appear larger and more luminous, the cheekbones more prominent, and the skin almost translucent. The fever that accompanied it would often give a high, rosy flush to the cheeks, creating a striking contrast with the otherwise pale complexion, to a society obsessed with romanticism and the tragic heroine. These symptoms perfectly aligned with the aesthetic ideals of the time. You see this reflected in the fashion of the day: delicate, flowing fabrics, often white or pastel, designed to emphasize a slender, almost fragile silhouette. Corsets, already a staple, were sometimes even more tightly laced, further restricting breathing and contributing to the delicate appearance. You might hear a mother lamenting her daughter's robust health, wishing she possessed the delicate constitution that was so admired. This sounds utterly absurd to you, accustomed as you are to valuing vigor and vitality. But in the 19th century, strength was often associated with the working classes, while frailty and sensitivity were seen as hallmarks of refinement and aristocratic breeding. The consumptive, fading away with a mournful cough, embodied a tragic beauty, a soul too sensitive for the harsh realities of the world. One common historical truth is that tuberculosis was a devastating killer. However, what is less commonly understood is the extent to which society glamorized its symptoms. It wasn't just an illness, it was a muse. Consider the operas of Verdi, the novels of the Bronte sisters, or the poetry of Keats, all touched by the shadow of consumption, often portraying the disease as a romantic, almost spiritual, journey towards an early, beautiful death. You read stories of heroines who waste away gracefully, their suffering imbued with a sublime, almost artistic, quality. A more obscure detail is the popularity of mourning jewelry crafted from the hair of deceased loved ones, particularly those who succumbed to consumption. You might wear a delicate locket containing a lock of hair from a beloved sister, a tangible yet macabre reminder of her beautiful, tragically short life. These tokens weren't just about grief, they were also a public display of your family's brush with the disease. A somber badge of honor in a society deeply familiar with its ravages. It shows a strange intertwining of sorrow and a morbid sense of connection to the romanticized suffering. Historians still debate whether this romanticization of consumption was a conscious cultural phenomenon, a way to cope with an uncontrollable epidemic by finding beauty in its ugliness, or if it was merely an unconscious projection of the prevailing aesthetic ideals onto the most common form of suffering. Did the public truly desire the look of illness? Or did the illness simply produce a look that happened to align with their pre-existing notions of beauty and refinement? You might ponder this as you observe a painting of a languid, pale woman, her hand pressed to her chest, a look of serene resignation on her face. The reality, of course, was far from the poetic ideal. The angelic pallor was caused by anemia, the bright eyes by fever and dehydration, and the delicate flush by a persistent cough that burst tiny blood vessels. The graceful decline was a long, painful struggle involving night sweats, hemorrhages, and agonizing breathlessness. You know this intellectually, but the pervasive imagery of the time makes it hard to reconcile the romantic ideal with the grim reality. You see a beautiful portrait, and then you remember the stench of illness, the desperate struggle for breath, the coughing up of blood. The contrast is stark and chilling. Fashion, too, reflected this aesthetic. The ideal silhouette was slender, even gaunt. Clothing was often layered but lightweight, emphasizing a sense of fragility. You might notice the popularity of shawls and wraps, which not only offered a modicum of warmth, but also allowed the wearer to appear cloaked and somewhat ethereal, as if they might float away at any moment. The high collars and ruffled necklines often seen in portraits served to frame the delicate face and highlight the elongated neck, further enhancing the illusion of vulnerability. This wasn't just about looking good, it was about embodying an ideal that, tragically, was rooted in illness. Even the architecture of the period, particularly the grander, more ornate styles, seemed to carry a hint of the consumptive aesthetic. Think of the intricate, delicate ironwork, the soaring spires, the Gothic revival elements that emphasized height and fragility over robustness. You might walk past a newly built mansion, its decorative elements almost skeletal in their delicacy, and feel a subconscious connection to the prevailing ideal of frail beauty. It's as if the very structures around you were echoing the cultural fascination with the ethereal and the impermanent. The impact of this aesthetic extended beyond individual appearance. It shaped social interactions, leading to a kind of morbid curiosity about those afflicted. You might find yourself drawn to a conversation about someone's condition, a hushed discussion about their decline, almost as if it were a performance. There was a sense of drama surrounding the consumptive, a tragic narrative unfolding before your eyes. This, of course, added another layer of suffering for those genuinely ill. As they became objects of both pity and fascination, you could almost feel the uncomfortable gaze, the hushed whispers, as you navigate a room. This unique intertwining of disease and beauty served as a coping mechanism for a society that felt powerless against an invisible killer. By romanticizing consumption, people could perhaps bring a sense of order or meaning to the chaos and death that surrounded them. If the dying could be seen as beautiful, if their suffering had an almost spiritual quality, then perhaps the terror of the disease could be lessened, or at least made more bearable. You might, in your own quiet moments, find yourself clinging to this fragile idea, seeking some shred of solace in the face of so much loss. It's a coping mechanism, yes, but a deeply flawed and disturbing one. As it obscures the very real pain and horror of the disease, you're struck down by the insidious cough, the persistent fever, the slow, agonizing decline that marks you as a victim of consumption. In the 19th century, for those with a glimmer of hope or a modicum of means, there was one place people often sought refuge: the sanatorium. These were not hospitals in the modern sense, but rather specialized institutions, often nestled and remote. Elevated locations, promising a cure through fresh air, rest, and a strict regimen. Imagine stepping off a carriage, gasping slightly from the exertion, and looking up at a grand, imposing building nestled amongst pine trees, high in the mountains. The air here feels thinner, crisper, supposedly imbued with healing properties. You're told that the clean, cool air, away from the noxious fumes of the city, will cleanse your lungs and restore your vitality. This is your new home, perhaps for months or even years. A place of both desperate hope and quiet despair, life in a sanatorium was rigidly structured, adhering to the prevailing, though largely unproven, theories of treatment. Your days revolve around cure hours, You're instructed to spend countless hours outdoors, often bundled in blankets on a reclining chair on a spacious veranda. Regardless of the weather, you breathe in the pine-scented air, watching the clouds drift by, listening to the persistent, hacking coughs of your fellow patients echoing around you. It's a stark reminder that you are not alone in your suffering, but also that escape from the disease is, for most, a distant dream. The diet is another crucial component. You are encouraged to consume large quantities of rich, fatty foods, milk, eggs, and often raw meat in the belief that such nourishment would help you build up your strength and resist the wasting effects of the disease. You force down spoonfuls of cod liver oil, its fishy taste lingering on your tongue, hoping that each fatty drop brings you closer to recovery. It's a monotonous, often unappetizing regimen, but you adhere to it religiously, driven by the desperate hope for a return to health. One common historical understanding is that sanatoriums were places of healing and recovery. While this was the intent, the reality was often far grimmer. Many patients, particularly those in advanced stages of the disease, saw little improvement or experienced only temporary respite before succumbing. For every story of a miraculous recovery, there were countless tales of slow, agonizing decline within the sanatorium walls. You often hear the hushed whispers about a patient who took a turn for the worse overnight, or whose coughing fits grew so severe they disturbed the entire ward. A more obscure detail about sanatorium life is the peculiar social hierarchy that often developed among patients. While all were united by their illness, unspoken divisions arose based on the severity of their condition, their social class, or how long they had been there. The old-timers might share tips or grim jokes, while new arrivals clung to naive hope. You might observe a subtle social dance, with patients forming cliques, sharing books, or playing quiet games, all while the specter of death loomed over every interaction. Friendships, often forged in the crucible of shared suffering, could be tragically short-lived. Historians still debate whether the perceived benefits of sanatorium treatment were primarily due to the fresh air and rest, or simply the improved nutrition and isolation from sources of reinfection. Was the mountain air truly curative, or did the simple act of removing patients from their overcrowded, unsanitary urban environments and providing them with regular meals and minimal stress contribute more to any observed improvements? You might wonder yourself as you spend your days reclined on the veranda, feeling a fleeting sense of improvement one day, only to wake up drenched in sweat the next. The isolation from family and friends was another harsh reality. Correspondence was often the only link to your former life. Letters treasured and reread countless times. Visits were rare, often difficult due to the remote locations of many sanatoriums, and always tinged with sadness. A painful reminder of the life you had left behind. You yearn for the familiar faces, the sounds of your old home, but you know that contact could put your loved ones at risk, and your isolation is part of the cure for those who could afford it. Sanatoriums represented a glimmer of hope, a last resort in a world without antibiotics. But for the vast majority of the population, these institutions were simply out of reach. The cost of long-term care, the loss of income from the patient, and the sheer logistical challenge of transportation meant that only the relatively affluent could contemplate such a path. You know that for many, their only sanatorium was their own crowded, unsanitary bed, surrounded by family members who were also vulnerable. The psychological toll of sanatorium life cannot be overstated. You are constantly surrounded by illness, by coughing, by the faint smell of disinfectant and decay. You witness the slow decline of others, a chilling preview of your own potential future. Hope, while present, is often intertwined with despair. Patients sometimes formed deep bonds, finding solace in shared suffering, only to experience crushing grief when a new friend passed away. The constant awareness of your own mortality, coupled with the enforced idleness, could lead to profound depression and loneliness. Sometimes, The very act of being admitted to a sanatorium was seen as an admission of inevitable decline, a last stop on the road to death. You might hear whispers from those outside. "Oh, he's gone to the sanatorium," said with a knowing, sorrowful tone. This societal perception added another layer of burden to the patients, who were not only battling a physical disease, but also the crushing weight of public expectation and their own dwindling hope. The irony is not lost on you. A place meant to heal could also feel like a prelude to the end. The architecture of these institutions often reflected the prevailing belief in light and air. Large windows, spacious balconies, and south-facing rooms were common, designed to maximize exposure to sunlight, which was believed to have therapeutic properties. You might spend hours simply gazing out of your window, watching the seasons change, counting the days, hoping for a flicker of improvement, a sign that the fresh air and rest were indeed working their slow, often imperceptible. Magic. It's a quiet existence, punctuated only by the routine of meals, temperature checks, and the ever-present coughs of others. You exist in a world where the insidious cough isn't just a physical ailment, it's a brutal economic sentence. In the 19th century, tuberculosis mercilessly exposed and exacerbated the gaping chasm between the rich and the poor, making socioeconomic status a chilling predictor of survival. If you were born into poverty, your chances of escaping consumption's clutches plummeted dramatically. Imagine your family living in a cramped, dark tenement in the heart of the city. The air is perpetually stale, thick with the dampness of laundry hung indoors, the lingering scent of inadequate sanitation, and the faint, unsettling odor of illness. Sunlight rarely penetrates the narrow alleys between buildings, and ventilation is a luxury you can't afford. This isn't just an unpleasant living situation, it's a breeding ground for disease. The very bricks of your home seem to harbor the invisible killer. When a family member, perhaps your younger sister, starts to cough, your heart sinks with a heavy dread that has nothing to do with medical knowledge and everything to do with grim experience. You know that, unlike the wealthy, who can afford doctors, country retreats, or the elusive sanatoriums, your options are devastatingly limited. There's no escaping the crowded conditions, no access to nourishing food beyond the meager scraps you can afford, and certainly no time for prolonged rest if every family member's income is vital for survival. Poverty's cruel hand manifested in countless ways. Malnutrition was rampant among the working classes. You're constantly hungry, your body lacking the nutrients to build a strong immune system. A diet of watery soup, stale bread, and perhaps a rare tough piece of meat does little to fortify you against the relentless assault of the disease. Your body, already weakened by chronic undernourishment, becomes an easy target for the bacterium. This wasn't just about feeling hungry, it was about your very cells being unable to mount a defense. Then there's the overcrowding. You share a single room, perhaps even a single bed, with your entire family. Personal space is an unheard of luxury when one person falls ill. The chances of others contracting the disease skyrocket. You sleep inches away from a coughing sibling, breathing in the very air that carries the deadly microbes. Isolation, a key factor in preventing spread, is simply impossible in your living conditions. The very act of living becomes a risk. Working conditions are another significant factor. You might spend your days in a dimly lit, dusty factory, your lungs constantly irritated by textile fibers, coal dust, or chemical fumes, or perhaps you toil in a sweatshop, hunched over a sewing machine for 14 hours a day, breathing the stale, recycled air shared by dozens of others. These environments aren't just uncomfortable, they actively compromise your respiratory system, making your lungs more susceptible to infection and accelerating the disease's progression. The very work that sustains your family also threatens your life. One common historical understanding is that tuberculosis affected everyone, while true in a broad sense. What is often less emphasized is the disproportionate impact on the poor. The disease was inextricably linked to the social conditions of the working class. It wasn't just a matter of bad luck, it was a systemic failure of public health and social support, trapping millions in a cycle of illness and poverty. You'd see the stark contrast between the consumptive poor, wasting away in their squalid homes, and the rare, affluent patient receiving care in a private sanatorium. A more obscure detail is the phenomenon of consumption debt. When a family member fell ill, especially the primary breadwinner, the family often plunged deeper into debt. Medical treatments, even the ineffective ones, cost money. Loss of wages meant less food on the table, further weakening the remaining family members. Funerals, though simple, still carried a cost. You might see families selling off their meager possessions, a cherished piece of furniture, a few precious heirlooms just to cover the mounting expenses, pushing them further into destitution. This wasn't just about illness, it was about economic ruin. Historians still debate whether the urban environment itself, with its pollution and density, was the primary driver of tuberculosis among the poor, or if the underlying poverty leading to poor nutrition. Overcrowding and lack of sanitation was the more significant contributing factor. Was it the air you breathed, or the conditions in which you breathed it? That sealed your fate. You might look out from your window at the smog-filled sky and then back at your sickly family, wondering which curse was truly greater. The lack of access to clean water and proper sanitation also played a critical role. You often share a single outdoor privy with dozens of other families, or rely on communal water pumps that are easily contaminated. The concept of germ theory is still decades away from widespread acceptance, so the link between contaminated water, poor hygiene, and disease transmission isn't yet understood. You simply live with the constant threat of illness, never quite knowing where the next contagion will come from. Child labor, prevalent in this era, further compounded the vulnerability of the poor. Children as young as 6 or 7 were sent to work in factories or mines, their developing lungs and bodies subjected to the same brutal conditions as adults. Often worse, you might see children with hacking coughs, their tiny frames already showing the signs of consumption. Their childhood stolen by the need to contribute to the family income. The tragedy of a child consumed by the disease. Their potential snuffed out before it could even blossom. Was a depressingly common sight. The sheer scale of death among the impoverished was staggering. Graveyards swelled with the unmarked graves of those who succumbed to consumption, their lives cut short by a disease that flourished in conditions of deprivation. You'd see the weekly carts collecting the dead, a grim procession that was an all-too-familiar sight in the poorer districts. It wasn't just a health crisis, it was a social catastrophe, a silent culling of the most vulnerable members of society. In this context, the notion of personal responsibility for health, a concept sometimes put forth by the more privileged, rings hollow. How can you be responsible for your health when every aspect of your life, your home, your food, your work conspires against it? Your fight against tuberculosis is not just a personal battle. It is a desperate struggle against the systemic injustices of your time. A battle you are often destined to lose before it even truly begins. You are living through an age of profound mystery, where the most devastating disease is an invisible enemy, its origins and true nature shrouded in ignorance, yet, in the quiet, methodical corners of laboratories and the meticulous observations of dedicated physicians, the first faint glimmers of understanding are beginning to emerge. This is the dawn of medical breakthroughs, a slow, painstaking journey to unravel the secrets of tuberculosis. Imagine the frustration of doctors, faced daily with dying patients, yet utterly powerless to stop the relentless march of consumption. They record symptoms, perform autopsies, and offer what little comfort they can. But a genuine cure remains elusive. The prevailing theories of miasma and humoral imbalances offer no real solutions. It is against this backdrop of widespread despair that a few tenacious minds begin to challenge the status quo. armed with little more than curiosity and persistence, one of the earliest, yet profoundly significant. Steps was the development of the stethoscope by René Laennec in 1816. You might recall seeing a physician place a wooden tube to a patient's chest, listening intently before this invention. Doctors relied on simply placing their ear to the patient's body, a less precise and often awkward method. With the stethoscope, for the first time, medical practitioners could hear the subtle, telltale sounds within the lungs, the crackles, the wheezes, the hollow sounds that indicated cavities, allowing for earlier, more accurate diagnosis of consumption. It was a simple device, yet it revolutionized the physical examination, giving doctors a clearer window into the ravaged lungs of their patients. However, the greatest leap forward came with the advent of germ theory, though its acceptance was a hard-won battle. For centuries, disease was believed to spontaneously generate or arise from environmental factors, but pioneers like Louis Pasteur in France, with his groundbreaking work on microorganisms and fermentation in the 1860s, began to lay the foundation for understanding that tiny, unseen entities could cause disease. You might hear whispers of these radical new ideas, dismissed by many as fanciful or unproven, yet slowly gaining traction among the more forward-thinking scientists. The definitive moment arrived in 1882 when the German physician and microbiologist Robert Koch announced his discovery of Mycobacterium tuberculosis, the bacillus responsible for consumption. Imagine the electrifying news spreading through the scientific community. For the first time, the invisible enemy had a name, a form, a tangible identity. Koch's meticulous work, involving isolating the bacterium, growing it in a pure culture, and then reproducing the disease in animals, provided irrefutable proof. You see images in scientific journals, crude but clear, of the rod-shaped bacilli, the very cause of so much suffering. Finally revealed under the microscope, this discovery was monumental, a true turning point. It shifted the paradigm from vague theories of bad air to the precise understanding of a specific pathogen. Suddenly, doctors knew what they were fighting, even if they didn't yet have the weapons to fight it effectively. This led to new avenues of research, focusing on how the bacterium spread, how it infected the body, and crucially, how it might be stopped. You feel a sense of profound relief, mixed with a chilling understanding of how long humanity had been battling an unseen foe. One common historical fact is Koch's discovery of the tuberculosis bacillus. What is often overlooked, however, is the intense skepticism and resistance he faced from the established medical community. Many prominent physicians clung to older theories, finding it hard to believe that microscopic organisms, invisible to the naked eye, could wreak such havoc. It took years of persistent advocacy, rigorous scientific proof, and the gradual erosion of entrenched beliefs for germ theory to become widely accepted. You might read accounts of heated debates in medical societies, as the old guard struggled to reconcile new evidence with their long-held convictions. A more obscure detail related to early research is the desperate, often morally ambiguous, practice of autopsies performed on deceased patients to study the effects of the disease firsthand. Before advanced imaging techniques, dissecting the bodies of those who succumbed to consumption was a primary way to understand the disease's progression and its impact on organs like the lungs, liver, and intestines. You might imagine dedicated anatomists, often working in grim conditions, meticulously documenting the ravaged tissues, piecing together the puzzle of the disease one deceased patient at a time. It was a grisly necessity, laying the groundwork for the future understanding. Historians still debate whether Koch's discovery would have been as impactful without the foundational work of earlier scientists who hinted at microscopic causes for disease, or if his meticulous methodology alone was the true game changer. Was it a culmination of gradual scientific progress, or a singular stroke of genius that fundamentally altered the course of medicine? You might ponder how different the timeline of human suffering might have been if his discovery had come even a decade earlier. Following Koch's breakthrough, the focus shifted to identifying ways to detect and prevent the spread of the bacillus. Efforts were made to develop diagnostic tests. Though these were still in their infancy, the concept of sterilization gained traction, with surgeons slowly adopting practices like boiling instruments and washing hands. Though resistance to these simple, life-saving measures was surprisingly widespread, you might observe doctors beginning to wear cleaner coats, or even gloves. Subtle shifts in practice that slowly began to reduce cross-contamination. The search for a vaccine or a cure began in earnest, though it would be a long and arduous road. Koch himself, in 1890, announced tuberculin, initially believing it to be a cure, while it proved ineffective as a treatment and even harmful in some cases. It later became a valuable diagnostic tool, used in the tuberculin skin test to identify exposure to the bacterium. This demonstrates the iterative nature of scientific progress. Failures often pave the way for later successes, turning an initial misstep into a crucial diagnostic asset. You feel the wave of initial excitement and then the crushing disappointment when the promised cure doesn't materialize. The understanding that tuberculosis was contagious, thanks to germ theory, also began to influence public health policy. Campaigns, however rudimentary, started to educate people about the dangers of spitting and the importance of fresh air and sunlight. You might see early public service posters, simplistic in design, urging people to cover their mouths when they coughed. A small but significant step towards controlling the spread. This new knowledge, though slow to diffuse, marked the beginning of a concerted effort to combat the disease on a broader, societal level. Rather than just treating individual patients, these early medical breakthroughs, while not immediately eradicating tuberculosis, fundamentally changed humanity's approach to the disease. The enemy was no longer a mysterious curse or a miasma. It was a living organism that could be studied, understood, and eventually fought. You stand on the cusp of a new era, where science, not superstition, will eventually offer a path forward. Though the journey will still be long and fraught with challenges, you now understand the enemy, not as a mystical curse, but as a microscopic foe. This newfound knowledge, sparked by scientific breakthroughs, begins to ripple outwards, slowly but surely impacting the public sphere. This is where the long and arduous fight for public health truly begins. A battle not just against a bacterium, but against entrenched habits, social inequalities, and widespread ignorance. Imagine the sheer scale of the challenge. For centuries, disease was a private affliction, dealt with behind closed doors. Now, with the understanding that tuberculosis is contagious, the concept of public health emerges as a vital, collective responsibility. You begin to hear discussions in town halls, in medical societies, and even in the burgeoning popular press about the need for systemic change. Not just individual treatment. It's a radical idea that the health of one affects the health of all. One of the earliest and most fundamental initiatives was the push for improved sanitation. You see reformers advocating for cleaner streets, better sewage systems, and access to fresh, potable water. The foul-smelling miasma theory, while incorrect in its reasoning, had inadvertently highlighted the importance of cleanliness. Now, with germ theory, the connection was clear. Filth harbored microbes. You might witness the slow, often grudging, implementation of public waste collection, the construction of rudimentary sewage pipes, and the tireless efforts to replace contaminated wells with safer water sources. These changes are slow, expensive, and often met with resistance from those who see them as unnecessary intrusions or financial burdens. Another crucial battleground was housing reform. You see social reformers and concerned citizens lobbying for better living conditions in the overcrowded slums. The dark, damp, poorly ventilated tenements were recognized as breeding grounds for consumption. Efforts are made to introduce building codes that mandate minimum light and air requirements. Though these are often weakly enforced or outright ignored, you might pass by newly constructed model tenements, built with slightly larger windows and better ventilation, a testament to these early efforts. But they are few and far between compared to the vast, unhealthy sprawl of the city. The very simple act of spitting became a major public health concern, with the understanding that the tuberculosis bacillus was expelled in the sputum of infected individuals. Public health campaigns began to emerge. Discouraging this common habit, you might see rudimentary posters or signs in public places, urging citizens do not spit, or consumption is spread by spit. This seems like a minor detail today, but in the 19th century, public spitting was commonplace. Enforcing such a seemingly simple rule required a massive shift in public behavior and awareness. A slow and often frustrating process. One common historical fact is that public health initiatives began to address major diseases in the 19th century. What is often overlooked, however, is the fierce resistance these initiatives sometimes faced, particularly from vested economic interests. Factory owners and landlords often resisted regulations that would cost them money, such as improving ventilation in workplaces or upgrading housing. You might read newspaper editorials decrying government overreach or unnecessary expenditures. Highlighting the tension between profit and public welfare, a more obscure detail is the development of spittoons in public places, often filled with disinfectant, to provide a sanitary place for people to expectorate. As a compromise given the difficulty of eliminating the habit entirely, you might see these metal or ceramic receptacles in train stations, pubs, and public buildings, a physical manifestation of the ongoing battle against airborne transmission. It's a strange sight to you, a direct reflection of a public health challenge that feels utterly alien to your modern sensibilities. Historians still debate whether the public health movement gained more traction due to a genuine philanthropic concern for the poor, or if the fear of contagion spreading from the slums to the more affluent neighborhoods was the primary motivator for investment in sanitation and housing reform. Was it compassion or self-preservation? That truly fueled the push for a healthier society. You might consider this as you observe a wealthy patron donating to a charity for slum clearance. Wondering about their true underlying motivations, education played a crucial role. Public health advocates and concerned doctors began writing pamphlets and delivering lectures, explaining in simple terms how the disease was spread and what individuals could do to protect themselves. You might pick up a small, cheaply printed booklet advising on the importance of fresh air, sunlight, and proper diet, or listen to a fiery speech in a community hall about the dangers of living in squalor. This was the nascent stage of health literacy, an attempt to empower the public with knowledge. However limited, the establishment of boards of health in cities and states marked a significant shift towards centralized, governmental oversight of public well-being. These nascent public health departments were tasked with monitoring disease outbreaks, enforcing sanitary regulations, and conducting rudimentary epidemiological studies. You see these fledgling bureaucracies slowly gaining authority, laying the groundwork for the robust public health systems of the future. It's a slow, incremental buildup, but each step is a brick in the foundation of a healthier society. Despite these efforts, the fight was an uphill climb. The sheer scale of urban poverty, the rapid growth of industrial cities, and the deeply ingrained habits of the population meant that progress was often agonizingly slow. You still witness the pervasive suffering, the continued high mortality rates. But now, there is at least a glimmer of organized resistance. The focus shifts from merely treating the sick to preventing the disease from taking hold in the first place. A fundamental change in philosophy, the role of nursing too, began to evolve in this context. Public health nurses, often working in deprived areas, would visit homes, educating families on hygiene, nutrition, and disease prevention. You might encounter a stern but compassionate nurse, her uniform stark against the grimy backdrop of the tenement, offering advice and practical assistance, a direct link between the emerging scientific knowledge and the struggling families. These individuals were on the front lines, battling not only the disease but also the despair and hopelessness it engendered. You're immersed in a century where the insidious cough isn't just a grim medical reality, but a pervasive cultural motif, seeping into the very stories you read, the plays you watch, and the music that stirs your soul. Tuberculosis, or consumption, left an indelible mark on the literary echoes of the plague, shaping narratives and characters in profound and often tragic ways. Imagine opening a novel, perhaps one of the popular serials devoured by the public, and encountering a character, a beautiful young woman or a sensitive young man, who begins to waste away. Their skin grows pale, their eyes become unnaturally bright, and a delicate cough punctuates their every sentence. You recognize these symptoms immediately, not from medical textbooks, but from the tragic figures who populate the pages before you. This is the consumptive heroine, or the doomed artist, a literary archetype born directly from the widespread reality of the disease. The slow, gradual decline of consumption lent itself perfectly to dramatic narrative. Unlike sudden, violent deaths, consumption allowed for extended scenes of suffering, contemplation, and emotional farewells. Authors used the disease as a potent symbol of fragility, transient beauty, and the harsh realities of life. You read descriptions of characters clinging to life, expressing their final poignant thoughts, their fading breath adding a layer of melancholic depth to their words. This prolonged farewell offered writers ample opportunity to explore themes of love, loss, and the nature of mortality. Consider the works of authors like Charles Dickens, where the impoverished and sickly often succumb to consumption, highlighting the social injustices of the era. Or think of the Bronte sisters, whose own lives were tragically touched by the disease, and whose characters often embody a delicate, almost ethereal quality often associated with consumptive beauty. You might read Wuthering Heights and feel the chill of the moor and the slow, internal torment of Catherine, reflecting a society intimately familiar with the ravages of the illness. One common historical understanding is that literature reflects the times in which it is written. What is often less explored, however, is the active role literature played in shaping public perception of tuberculosis. By portraying the consumptive as a figure of tragic beauty, sensitivity, and often moral purity, literature inadvertently contributed to the romanticization of the disease, masking its gruesome reality with an aesthetic veneer. Did the public absorb these romantic ideals, subtly altering their perception of the illness from a medical horror to a beautiful, albeit fatal, affliction? You might find yourself caught between the artistic portrayal and the grim reality you know. A more obscure detail is how the sound of a cough became a powerful literary device. Authors would use it as an ominous foreshadowing, a sign of impending doom. A character's cough, initially dismissed as a cold, would gradually become more frequent, more ragged, building suspense and dread for the reader. You could almost hear the character's deterioration through the repeated descriptions of their worsening cough. A subtle but effective way to convey the progression of the disease without resorting to explicit medical detail. Historians still debate whether the literary portrayal of consumption was primarily a mirror of existing societal attitudes, or if it actively influenced and perpetuated the romantic aesthetic surrounding the disease. Did writers merely capture what they saw? Or did their artistic interpretations amplify and solidify the cultural fascination with consumptive beauty? You might consider how much of your own perception of the 19th century is colored by these fictional narratives. The theme of doomed love became inextricably linked with consumption. Lovers would often be separated by the disease, one fading away while the other grieved. This added a layer of profound pathos, emphasizing the transient nature of happiness and the cruel hand of fate. You read tales of passionate, yet ultimately tragic, romances, where the disease serves as the ultimate barrier, a force more powerful than any societal obstacle. The consumptive character often embodies an intensified emotional depth, their impending death sharpening their perception and experience of life and love, even in children's literature. The specter of consumption appeared, while often softened for younger audiences. Themes of illness, loss, and the acceptance of death were sometimes conveyed through characters succumbing to a vague, wasting sickness. These stories served, perhaps unintentionally, to normalize illness and prepare children for the inevitable losses they would witness in their own families and communities. You might recall a childhood story where a beloved character, after a prolonged illness, simply fell asleep and didn't wake up. A euphemism for consumption's quiet. Final act. The influence of consumption extended to poetry, where the ethereal and melancholic nature of the disease resonated with the romantic and later Victorian sensibilities. Poets like John Keats, who himself died of tuberculosis at a young age, imbued his verse with a sense of mortality and the fleeting nature of beauty. You read his lines, knowing the grim reality of his own suffering, and feel the added weight of his words. A poignant testament to the disease's personal and artistic impact, the literary treatment of consumption also served as a form of social commentary, by depicting the suffering of the poor and the conditions that exacerbated the disease. Authors subtly, or sometimes overtly, critiqued the social inequalities of their time. The death of a consumptive child in a squalid tenement could be a powerful indictment of societal neglect, stirring the consciences of readers who might otherwise remain oblivious to the struggles of the less fortunate. The pervasive presence of consumption in literature demonstrates how deeply it permeated the collective consciousness of the 19th century. It wasn't just a medical fact, it was a cultural touchstone, a universal experience that resonated with readers across all social strata. You might close a book, feeling a profound sense of sadness, not just for the characters, but for the millions who lived and died with the same relentless, beautiful, and utterly devastating disease. The stories you read are not just fiction, they are echoes of a very real, very widespread sorrow. You've heard the statistics, explored the misguided cures, and seen how the disease shaped society and art. But beyond the broad strokes of history lies the raw, intimate agony of individual lives touched by this relentless plague. This is where the true horror of tuberculosis resides, in the personal stories of suffering. The heartbreaking realities endured by countless individuals and their families. Imagine your younger brother, full of youthful vigor and mischief, suddenly slowing down. He used to chase after stray dogs in the street, his laughter echoing down the alley. Now, he tires easily, his cough a persistent, hacking sound that grows louder with each passing week. You watch, helpless, as his bright eyes grow dull, his cheeks hollow, and his small frame begins to waste away. Every labored breath he takes, every bead of sweat on his brow during the feverish nights, is a dagger to your heart? This isn't a statistic. This is your family, your flesh and blood. Being consumed before your very eyes, the psychological toll on family members was immense. You live with constant anxiety, listening for every cough, every restless shift in the bed. Sleep becomes a luxury, punctuated by the sounds of suffering. The sheer helplessness in the face of an incurable disease breeds a profound sense of despair. You might try every folk remedy, every patent medicine, spending your meager savings in desperate, futile attempts to bring comfort, if not a cure. The emotional exhaustion of watching a loved one slowly die, knowing there is nothing truly effective you can do. Is a burden almost too heavy to bear? Consider the mothers who watch their children fade away, one after another. A family might lose 3, 4, even 5 children to consumption, the repeated grief scarring them for life. You might witness a mother, her face etched with sorrow, attending yet another funeral for a tiny coffin, her dreams for her children shattered by the invisible killer. The sheer normalcy of child mortality due to consumption during this era is chilling to your modern sensibilities. Then there are the personal sacrifices. Families would often devote themselves entirely to caring for the ill, sometimes for months or years. The burden of nursing fell heavily on women, who juggled household chores, childcare, and the relentless demands of a sickbed. You might see a daughter foregoing marriage or a son giving up a promising apprenticeship, dedicating their youth to caring for an ailing parent, knowing that their own lives were being put on hold, perhaps indefinitely. The disease wasn't just claiming one life, it was often reshaping, even consuming, the lives of entire households. One common historical fact is the high mortality rate of tuberculosis. What is often overlooked, however, are the specific, agonizing symptoms that individuals endured day after day. The constant cough, often producing blood, was not just an inconvenience, it was a debilitating torment. The night sweats would leave patients drenched and shivering, leading to constant chills and fatigue. The progressive weight loss, known as consumption itself, meant a slow starvation, rendering victims too weak to even lift their heads. You might see someone struggling to swallow even a spoonful of broth, their body rejecting nourishment. A truly heartbreaking sight. A more obscure detail is the phenomenon of physical voice, a particular quality of voice common in advanced stages of consumption, often hoarse or whispery due to damage to the larynx. Imagine listening to a loved one, their voice once strong and clear, now reduced to a faint, strained whisper, each word a desperate effort. It's a subtle but poignant indicator of the disease's grip, making every conversation a painful reminder of their fading strength. Historians still debate the full extent of the psychological impact of living with a chronic, fatal illness like tuberculosis in an era without effective treatment or mental health support. Did the constant fear of contagion, the inevitable decline, and the isolation lead to widespread depression, anxiety, or even a form of fatalism among the populace? You might observe people who seem to carry a quiet resignation, an acceptance of their inevitable fate, a profound sadness that permeates their very being. The social stigma associated with the disease also added to the suffering, while sometimes romanticized in art, in real life. Consumption could lead to ostracism. People feared contagion, so those afflicted were often shunned. However subtly, you might find friends or acquaintances keeping their distance, avoiding your home, or making excuses to cancel visits, driven by a primal fear of contracting the illness. This isolation deepened the despair of the sick and their families, adding loneliness to their already immense physical and emotional pain. For children, the suffering was particularly cruel. Unlike adults who might have built a life, children were robbed of their very beginnings. Their bodies, less developed, often succumbed more quickly, and their innocence made their pain all the more unbearable to witness. You might see a child struggling to play, their energy depleted, their laughter replaced by gasps for air, a stark reminder of the disease's indiscriminate cruelty. The loss of a child was a common tragedy, yet never less devastating. Even if a patient did experience a temporary remission, the fear of relapse was ever present. You might see someone regain a little strength, their cough lessening, and a flicker of hope might ignite. But then, a slight chill, a new cough, and the terror returns, knowing that the disease often returned with renewed ferocity. Leaving little hope for a second recovery, this constant sword of Damocles hanging over their heads meant that true peace of mind was rarely attainable. These personal stories, though rarely recorded in detail in official histories, form the true tapestry of the 19th century tuberculosis epidemic. They speak of unimaginable courage, profound grief, and the enduring human spirit in the face of overwhelming adversity. You carry the weight of these unspoken tragedies, a testament to the disturbing reality of a disease that ravaged not just bodies, but souls and families. You've journeyed through the dark landscape of 19th century tuberculosis, witnessing its devastating reach, the desperate attempts at cure, and its haunting presence in everyday life. Now, as the century draws to a close and a new one dawns, the grip of consumption begins its slow, hard-won retreat from the forefront of public consciousness. Leaving behind a lingering shadow and a profound legacy, imagine standing at the precipice of the 20th century. The scientific breakthroughs of Koch and Pasteur, once radical, are now forming the bedrock of modern medicine. Germ theory is gaining wider acceptance, slowly displacing the miasma theory, while a definitive cure is still decades away. Humanity now understands what it is fighting, and that knowledge sparks a new wave of optimism and strategic action. This isn't a sudden victory, but a gradual turning of the tide. Driven by persistent scientific inquiry and public health reforms, the emphasis shifts dramatically from individual, often futile, treatments to large-scale public health campaigns and prevention. You see widespread efforts to improve urban sanitation, cleaner water supplies, more efficient sewage systems, and better waste management slowly begin to transform cities. Housing reforms, though incremental, start to chip away at the overcrowded, unhealthy tenements, providing slightly more breathable spaces for the working poor. The fight for public health becomes a recognized and increasingly funded endeavor, a testament to the societal understanding that collective well-being is paramount. The establishment of sanatoriums, while still imperfect, evolves. They become more focused on strict regimens of rest, fresh air, and good nutrition, moving away from the more outlandish cures, while not a cure in themselves. These institutions did offer a controlled environment where patients were isolated, preventing further spread, and where some could recover sufficiently to return to a more productive life. You hear fewer tales of miraculous cures and more of slow, steady convalescence, a more realistic approach to managing the disease. One common historical fact is that tuberculosis rates began to decline in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. However, what is often overlooked is that this initial decline occurred before the advent of effective drug treatments. This strongly suggests that improved living conditions, better nutrition, and more effective public health measures such as sanitation, housing reform, and isolation of the sick played a far greater role in the initial reduction of tuberculosis mortality than any medical intervention of the time. You see the evidence: cleaner cities, healthier populations, and a gradual, almost imperceptible, retreat of the disease. A more obscure detail is the emergence of specialized tuberculosis dispensaries. These were outpatient clinics, often established in urban centers, designed to diagnose the disease early, educate the public, and provide basic care and advice to those who couldn't afford sanatoriums. They served as crucial hubs for early detection and public health education, providing a vital link between the medical establishment and the general population. You might have visited one yourself, a place offering a glimmer of hope and practical guidance in a time of pervasive fear. Historians still debate whether the decline in tuberculosis mortality was primarily driven by the top-down efforts of public health reformers, or by the organic improvements in living standards and nutrition brought about by general economic progress and workers' movements. Was it deliberate policy, or the gradual amelioration of poverty that truly pushed the disease back? You might consider how interwoven these factors truly are, each contributing to a complex, multifaceted victory. The cultural obsession with the consumptive aesthetic also begins to wane. As scientific understanding replaces romanticism, the pale, ethereal look is increasingly seen for what it is: a sign of debilitating illness, not beauty. The romantic tragic heroine slowly gives way to a more vigorous, robust ideal of health. You notice changes in fashion, in art, in the very way people talk about illness. The romantic veil begins to lift, revealing the grim reality beneath. However, The shadow of tuberculosis didn't vanish entirely. It continued to be a significant public health problem for many more decades, especially among the poor and marginalized. The development of effective antibiotic treatments, like streptomycin in the 1940s, would finally provide the true breakthrough, transforming a fatal illness into a curable one. But even then, the disease never truly disappeared. It merely receded into the background, becoming a problem primarily for developing nations and vulnerable populations. The legacy of the 19th century tuberculosis epidemic is profound. It forced humanity to confront the interconnectedness of health and social conditions, laying the groundwork for modern public health systems. It spurred countless scientific inquiries, leading to fundamental discoveries that revolutionized medicine. And it left an indelible mark on culture, art, and literature, reminding future generations of a time when an invisible killer held sway over millions. You understand now that the fight was long, arduous, and far from over. But the turning point had arrived. The night grows quiet now. The echoes of those coughing, struggling breaths fading into the past, the harsh realities of the 19th century, with its crowded streets and silent, invisible killer, begin to soften, receding into the gentle hum of the fan, the dim glow of your room. Take a deep breath, a full, easy breath, and feel the luxury of it. The freedom of air filling your lungs without pain or fear. That effortless inhale, that simple exhale, was a dream, a yearning for so many who lived in that time. Let the images of their struggle, their quiet suffering, gently drift away, replaced by the comforting rhythm of your own steady breathing. The world outside sleeps, and so too. Can you